Hey everyone, so my name is Jan and this is Garrett. Today we are going to be talking about web authentication. You might think web authentication seems like a perfectly solved problem because most likely when you have to authenticate users to your web app, you just download some library and plug it in and you're good to go. However, today we're going to look deeper into some of those libraries and see some potential bugs and problems that might not be obvious at first glance. The first one we'll take a quick look at is a Node. So how many people here use Node? Most hands, right? So I picked this because we use it a lot at where I work. And I've never specifically used Passport, but people tell me it's one of the most common Node auth libraries. As you can see, about 36,000 downloads a day. It's open source. The way it works is it has these authentication strategies, right? Not everyone uses username plus password. A lot of people want to use OAuth. But username and password is what we'll focus on today because it's easy to understand and it's still commonly used. So that's provided in a separate module by Passport Local. And the caller of this must provide their own password verification callback. However, Passport Local gives you an example of what a password verification function should look like. And it's pretty short and simple, so it's just checking if the password in the database is the same as the password that the user gave you. Sounds good? Not really. OK, there's something wrong here. Why are you comparing plain text passwords, right? Something you've probably learned a long time ago is that your server should never be storing user passwords in plain text, because then if your database gets compromised somehow, all of your accounts are hacked easily. So instead, what you should do is store these passwords as a salted hash. And that's widely known, but a more subtle problem with the function we just saw is that it's not a timing safe string comparison. And we'll go into what that means a little bit later. So that was kind of a toy example. But this happens in real life a lot, too. People get hacked, even when there are large companies like Adobe. So in 2013, some people may remember this. There were about 38 million active Adobe accounts that were compromised. And the entire database of passwords was posted online, and anyone could just download it. This was only the third largest password breach that year, amazingly. And OK, so hackers got the password database, but the passwords must be salted and hashed, right? Right? No, they were encrypted. Why isn't that as good as salting and hashing? Well, so encryption is not the same as hashing. Most importantly, encryption is an invertible function. So if you have the secret key and you have the ciphertext, you can invert the encryption function, that's what we usually call decryption, and get back to the plain text. But hashing is a one-way function. There's no information you can get that easily allows you to get from the hash output back to the input. So if you're given all the hashed output, the only way you can find the input is by brute forcing. And salting a hash is this technique to prevent statistical analysis so that if a bunch of users have the same password, they don't have the same output in your database. Because many users use the same common, easy-to-guess passwords. But Adobe did encryption, so you actually can do this kind of frequency analysis. And if you just look at the leaked database, which anyone could download, and you sort it by frequency, you see that a single password string, encrypted password, which is EQ7, et cetera, had about 2 million users using it. So 2 million people were using the same password. You know, what could it be? Any guesses? Yeah, I would have guessed password, but it turns out the password limit requirement was 6, so it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. And yeah, so 1.25% of users use this password. We already have some good guesses to what it could be. But the reason I know it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is because the leak contained password hints available to you in plain text. So Adobe didn't think that they didn't think that users would just put their password in a password hint. So they're like, well, we'll encrypt the password, but why would we encrypt the hints? There couldn't be anything in there. But if you just this is literally just a sample. I sorted lexicographically, but this is like the average password hint. Our password is online. The password is this. Some people were like, this is the same password I use on Gmail. This is the same password I use on all my accounts. So basically, if you got this, it's easy to pivot that into attacking people's email accounts and so forth. Oh, XKC had a great commentary about this, which is you're given these hints, you're given these opaque strings. You have to solve for what these strings are based on the hints. So this is the greatest crossword puzzle in the history of the world, pretty much. And for users, it was a garbage fire. A lot of their passwords could have just been trivially exposed. And if you could somehow get the single encryption key that Adobe used, then you could decrypt all 150 million passwords. All right, but let's assume your user's logged in.
Yeah,
what could go wrong?
Let's assume that you are storing passwords securely and your user's logged in. As you guys are probably aware, HTTP is a stateless protocol. And so we need some way to remember that we log that person in, who they are, what their deal is, et cetera. So this is a quick overview. It's probably a review for a lot of you guys. But so typically, as a developer, you have some kind of a session abstraction provided to you by your web framework. And this is usually like a key value store, like a dictionary, and you put arbitrary data into it. And then the framework handles the rest of what I'm about to talk about. So there's two broad common kinds of web sessions. There are these stateless sessions in which all the session data is sent to the client. So in Python land, which is what I'm familiar with, the Flask micro framework does this by default. And if you guys are more into JavaScript and you're using JWTs, JSON Web Tokens, which are apparently all the rage, that's basically the exact same thing, but with some more structure and some more vulnerabilities. There's also server-side sessions, which are very, very common, where you store all the data on the server, and that avoids the size limitations of cookies. And then you just send the client a little session identifier. So for example, this is what Django does by default. Once you have this session data, you include it in a response, and you want it to be persisted on the client. The classic way to do this is cookies. That's what they were designed to do. And cookies aren't the greatest. You might be familiar with their bizarre behavior that intersects with the same origin policy in a web browser, but also doesn't, and has a lot of weird caveats and exceptions. But over time, we've kind of evolved features to add to cookies that do make them pretty reasonable for managing sessions. So for example, there's this HTTP-only flag. And what that means is that JavaScript in a web page is not able to access or modify a cookie via the document.cookie accessor in JavaScript. And that's actually a really good thing, because it means that cross-site scripting attacks can't steal your session cookies and then reuse them elsewhere. There's also a secure flag, which prevents the browser from sending cookies over an insecure connection, i.e. a non-TLS HTTPS connection, which is also a really good thing. More recently, people are kind of fed up with cookies and want to use something that's more flexible and more ergonomic for a developer, so you're using your local storage in your browser. And that's got some benefits. It avoids some of the weirdness of cookies, but it also kind of is a backpedal in some ways. You're vulnerable to XSS. You can use content security policy, which is an access control framework for the browser that I helped work on at Mozilla. That'll definitely help you, and I recommend that you consider doing that. But there are some trade-offs. They both have their pluses and minuses. There's no real clear winner here. Great. So once you know how you're going to store it, you send that to the client, and then the client persists it and will send it back to you in subsequent requests. And that's how you maintain this state over time. So one problem with the sessions is that you might store data in there that the user has an interest in modifying. Maybe Alice has an account on your site. She has some credits. And she wants to do stuff, but she thinks she deserves, more of a balance to start with, right? So if you could just arbitrarily modify the session data, which you could in like a totally naive implementation, then all kinds of weird stuff could happen. There's a lot of ways you can try to avoid this, but the really common pattern is to use message authentication codes, or MACs, not laptops, cryptographic instructions. But so the basic idea of a MAC is that you have a message, M, that's in this case the serialized session data, and you've got a secret key, K. You feed them both into the MAC algorithm, and it outputs this thing called a MAC tag, which is the little green guy right there. And the MAC algorithm is designed so that it's difficult, cryptographically difficult, to generate a valid MAC tag if you don't know the key K. So you transmit your message plus the tag through the untrusted environment, which is the dark void in between these two brightly colored pastel squares. And then when the receiver gets the message and the MAC tag, they just recompute the MAC with the secret key that they know and compare the recomputed tag with the received tag. If they match, integrity is good to go, you're safe. Otherwise, shenanigans are afoot. This is interesting in the web context because the sender and the receiver are actually the same entity, right? It's the web server. It sends it from itself to itself through a round trip with the client, which is maybe a little confusing to people. So one common gotcha, this affects Flask, which is the example I'm giving here, but it's also a problem with JWTs, is that sessions are signed, but they're not encrypted. And that isn't always a problem. You know, if it's just like a random session ID, it doesn't really matter if somebody can read it. But in some cases, you might store information in the session that your user should not be able to read. This is kind of a toy example where you have a guess the number web app because we need those. You know, basically what you do is you generate like a number between 1 and 10. You store it in the session. That's the correct answer. You return it to the user. And then when they submit their guess, you just compare what was in the form they submitted to what was in the session. But because the session was persisted on their machine and it's not encrypted, they could just look at it and get the right answer every single time. This actually is a problem that you will see in various applications. I've audited several applications that do more complicated things, but with the same basic kind of misconception about how the underlying abstraction works, and it can be a pretty serious problem.
So another gotcha appears when you start comparing these MAC tags. That is, when you're trying to verify that the MAC is the expected value on the server. The obvious way is to use equal equal on two strings as a string comparison. But there's kind of a subtle problem here, which is that this equal equal function terminates as soon as there is a prefix mismatch between the two strings. For instance, if MAC starts with A and correct MAC starts with B, then the function says, oh, these don't match. Well, obviously the entire string isn't going to match, so we're just going to stop here. But if they have a longer prefix in common, then the function will run for a longer time. So the time it takes to run this varies depending on how similar A and B are. So I'll share these slides later. Then I wrote a little demo of this in Node. So the reason this can become a problem is when an attacker can measure the timing, they shouldn't learn any information about what the secret input is. And this is a pretty common problem that people have in their code. I actually saw it in an early version of Let's Encrypt, which a lot of people use. So I did a little demo, which I'm not going to run live, but basically it does this password equal equal expected password function, and it times it. And it times it against every possible every possible password guess of length 3, and that's alphabetical. So the actual password is foo, and we compare AAA, ABA, et cetera. And then we measure the time it takes for that comparison to finish. And indeed, even on this toy, very simple piece of code, you can see there's some timing variation. When there's no prefix mismatch, when there's no prefix match, it finishes faster in about 91 nanoseconds. And all the way on your right, where there's a full match on the string foo, it's about 115 nanoseconds. So yeah, so there are clear timing variations, and you can see this even in a language like JavaScript. And you might ask, so is this kind of timing difference of several nanoseconds measurable over the network? There's a 2007 study that found that you can get about 15 to 100 microsecond accuracy across the internet, and about as good as 100 nanoseconds over a local network. So that's about almost the same order of magnitude as what I just showed. So there's good evidence these attacks are practical in some situations. just to go over this, how can an attacker abuse this timing difference if they're trying to brute force a MAC? Let's say the MAC is hex encoded. So first they can try 0000, then they can try 1 as the first character, then a 2, all the way up to F. So they measure the MAC verification time for each of these strings. And they say, well, the one that took the longest probably had a prefix match. So that's probably the correct first character. And so they set that as the first character. Then they go on and repeat this for the second character and over again until they have the full string. And they've brute forced the entire secret. So one way to solve this problem in your code is to do a constant time comparison. This is a common way I've seen it done in Python and Node and other languages. Basically, you loop through the strings that you're comparing. That's the for loop with the car code at. And you XOR the two characters. And if they match, then they're a 0. If they don't match, they're a 1. And then you append that to a mismatch result. So basically, only if all of them match is the entire result 0. So that's a pretty easy way to do that. And so in Node, someone pointed out 2015 or 2016 that they weren't doing timing safe equality checks. So Node actually recently added this API, crypto timing safe equal, so you can just plug it in to your code. And I did that on my toy code from earlier, and as you can see, my code is slower by about an order of magnitude, but things are not running in a way that reveals my secret. Or at least not obviously. So constant time comparison, the security researcher Brad Hill has this quote where he says, it's good for native code, but in high-level languages, there's some problems. So he found that source code, which looks like it's constant time, doesn't always run that way because the compiler, the JIT, and runtime optimizers don't recognize timing as a program semantic. So in other words, there's no guarantee that this supposedly constant time function will be constant. So how do you solve that? Well, a simple way is to blind the timing channel. So instead of comparing these two strings directly, apply a pseudo-random function to the two strings, and then compare the outputs. So by definition, the outputs are uncorrelated to the inputs. They're just random functions of it. And so now when someone tries to measure the timing, they're measuring a timing of a random string, not the timing of the inputs. And so they can't recover that easily. So a common pseudo-random function is HMAC. And you can get that from the Node Crypto API easily. So basically here, I just HMAC'd both of my inputs and compared those instead. And that runs even slower.
I like the use of an HMAC to verify an HMAC. It's kind of like the yo dog of like cryptographic constructions. I heard you like verifying HMAC, so I put an HMAC. Anyway, so okay, let's say that you've got these first two really critical components down. You're storing passwords securely, and you're managing sessions securely. You're checking your HMAC with constant time comparison, no timing attacks. That's pretty good. There's a lot more that you could do wrong, but this is like a survey of like some very common things that people do wrong. So unfortunately, even if you as a developer do everything right here, you audit your libraries, you make sure your own code is secure, your users might still end up being hacked. Mostly because users, as we saw earlier, are really bad at choosing passwords. They choose weak passwords, and they reuse them across multiple sites all the time. A lot of you guys are technically savvy, so you probably use a password manager. Can I get a show of hands, people who use password managers? Wow. Wow. Oh my goodness, that's almost the entire room. Amazing. You guys are awesome. So the actual percentage of people who use password managers out of the entire population is very, very small. I think you actually have a number on it later. It's quite small. So password managers themselves are not a great solution for the majority of people, at least not yet. And they also create their own trade-offs for security. I mean, what if your password manager is compromised? Like, what if Tavis Ormandy just like takes an interest in it, as happens sometimes. So what else can we do, to protect users even when we know that they're fallible humans who will make poor decisions? So multi-factor authentication is the really common way to solve this. This is probably review for you guys, but just a quick one. The idea is to create this concept of an authentication factor. So there's knowledge factors, something you know, like a password. Possession factors, that's like something you have, like a key or a YubiKey or a phone, and something you are, like your fingerprint for Touch ID, or your entire face, I guess, is the new thing. But on the web, we don't really see these inherents, these like something you are factors often yet. Mostly we see a combination of password and possession factor. And there's a huge variety of designs and trade-offs and constraints in designing effective two-factor possession factors. So let's take a look at some common examples. Can I get a show of hands for people who do this? This kind of, you send a code to your phone when you log into web pages. Not as many, but a lot of people. Cool, OK. Yeah. So this is a really common technique for two-factor authentication. In this case, the possession factor is your phone, your cell phone. When you log into an account, like for example, I'm logging into Google, after they check your password, they'll just generate a one-time password, a short code, send you a text, and then you're supposed to type it in. And that proves that you have your phone. This is actually like a really common technique, mostly because it's really low friction. Like as a user, you don't need to get a new device or install any apps. Like you just receive texts. And there's kind of like a lesser appreciated reason why this is really nice, and that it helps you manage the life cycle of this two-factor device. Like a lot of people lose their phone and they don't have backups, or they migrate their phone and don't back up all their data. But you can still receive texts on your phone number, which doesn't tend to change that often. So there are some benefits to this, but in general, it's really bad. There we go. So you guys might remember in August of last year, or June of last year, the activist DeRay McKeeson's Twitter account was hacked, even though he was using two-factor authentication. The attackers were able to call up Verizon, say that they were DeRay, and ask to port his number to a SIM card that they controlled, at which point they began to receive all of his texts, including his one-time passwords. More recently, we've been seeing these attacks that exploit the SS7 routing protocol, which is used to interconnect telecoms and also handles SMS around the world. So thieves stole money from German banks in May using this type of exploit, and just last week, a security firm demonstrated a proof of concept where you can drain someone's Coinbase Bitcoin wallet with the same type of attack. So maybe you have like a really important online account. Like people read it a lot. Don't know why, but they do. And you want to make sure that people can't like take it over, log into it, and do weird stuff. So is there something better than these SMS one-time passwords? Well, the next step up is kind of these HMAC or time-based one-time passwords. You've probably seen these like little hardware tokens, or maybe you have an app on your phone like Authy or Google Authenticator. And these are very simple. Basically, you pre-share a symmetric key, a shared secret, with the server and your device. So when you're scanning that QR code at the beginning, that's communicating a random secret key to your device. And then it combines the secret key and a moving factor. So in the case of HTTP, that's just a simple counter, 1, 2, 3, et cetera. And with TOTP, you just take the current time and modulo it and get another simple counter. They're actually almost the same algorithm. But this is really nice, mostly because there's no SMS, there's no transport layer. The code is generated on your device, and you type it in. So it avoids a lot of the problems of SMS one-time passwords. And if you have the option to switch to this, it might not be a bad idea. Quick aside, it's great if you have the option to switch to this so you can have a more secure solution for logging in than SMS one-time passwords. But it's really important that the software provider honors that. So for Twitter, for example, you'd think that after the DeRay hack, they would have implemented like some more secure options than SMS one-time passwords. And if you go to the settings, which I did recently, there's an option that says set up a code generator app, which sounded really promising. So I did. And then I logged out, and I logged in again, and this is what I got. This is a page that's saying, hey, we texted you a one-time password. And I was like, what? So they do this for usability, right? Like people complain that the SMS OTPs don't work when you have no cellular service, like you're on an airplane. And that's true. But there's also a really important security trade-off that this implementation, which always sends you an SMS, no matter what, in every context, just doesn't, fails to achieve. So if anyone here works at Twitter, maybe take a look at this. And in general, takeaway for everybody is, I think it's it's really good to think about like what the trade-offs are with these systems, and they are complicated, but when you can, it's really good to give your users the option to protect themselves. You know, I don't think SMS OTPs are the end of the world. They have some useful side effects, useful benefits, but it's good to give people options to step it up if they feel like they might be at risk or under threat. Yeah, you may also. But in both these cases, you're still talking about a one-time password type of a two-factor scheme. And these are always vulnerable to other attacks. The most common one is phishing. So this is a phishing page. It looks like a Google change your password page. Although it's kind of fuzzy, but in the top left corner, you can see it's actually at login.logins-verify.com, which I'm pretty sure is not a Google registered domain name. And so if you were to get taken to this site, you're tricked. You would put in your current password, and then after you hit change password, it'll be like, hold on, I'm going to need a two-factor code. And so you get out your phone or open your app. It doesn't matter because it's just a one-time password. The attackers receive it and then turn around and man in the middle of the login in real time. They get into your account, and then that's the end of the story. These are from an account that was used by the Iranian government, or an attack by the Iranian government against activists in 2015, which is where it got my attention the first time. So the good news is that there's been some really promising developments in this regard in the past couple of years. Anybody here heard of U2F or security keys and used them? Yeah, okay, oh, interesting. A lot of, more heard, less used. Okay, yeah, maybe I can convince you. So this is a really cool standard. It was developed initially internally at Google, and then they created this industry group called FIDO, and now it's being actually kind of reworked in an open group, the W3C, in this web authentication spec. So this is meant to be like a comprehensive two-factor design that tries to solve a lot of these problems at once. Here's how it works. So there's kind of like three components of U2F. So already it's a little more complex than it was before. But on the right, you have the relying party. In U2F speak, that's the website you're logging into, so google.com. You have the client, which is your browser. And then you have a U2F device. And that's some kind of a secure element that stores secret data on your behalf. That could be a dedicated hardware token. It could be your phone. There's a lot of options. But you just have to have that role in the system. So at a very high level, it's just a challenge and response protocol. The relying party says, I want to make sure you're really you, and then you prove that you have access to this physical thing. So I'll send you a challenge. The client, the browser, will relay the challenge to the device, which will sign it with a private key, an asymmetric private key, and then return the signature of the challenge back to the relying party, who has a copy of the public key, and they just verify it. So if you guys have ever used SSH with public keys, it's very, very similar at a high level to that protocol, challenge and response based on asymmetric cryptography and signatures. But this actually adds a lot more onto that very simple idea. So the next step is that the relying party just generates a challenge, and then it sends it to the client, and then the client kind of extends that with some additional information. The first and the most important is that it adds the origin of the request. So in that phishing example, that would be loginverify.com or whatever. And so when the user created this public-private key pair and associated with their real Google account, that was google.com. And the U2F device actually keys it maps these private keys using the origin. So in this case, that earlier attack is totally foiled. There's just no way that the device will return a valid signature for the wrong domain. And then if you look at the spec, they kind of keep layering these interesting kind of optional ideas. There's too many to talk about here. But one that's kind of cool is that there's an optional thing called TLS channel ID, which allows you to create a unique identifier for a TLS connection between yourself and a server. And you can actually kind of include those in these assertions and these challenges as well. And that means that even if you have an attacker who's able to obtain a valid TLS certificate, they still won't be able to man in the middle your authentication process because they won't be able to spoof the channel ID. Yeah. The really cool thing is that while it's a fairly complex protocol, the user experience is still really simple. So they're trying to innovate on both the security and the usability. So you have to have a dedicated thing, which is a little bit of a higher bar than the SMS one-time passwords. But other than that, it's just name and password, do a user action, as they're called, on the device. It's tapping a button or responding to a prompt on your phone, and then you're good to go. Cool. So this has been kind of in the works for a while, and as we heard from the audience earlier, people have been hearing about it, but not people have been using it. And the reason why is because there's this big trade-off with U2F, which is that in order for it to work, you need buy-in from 3 separate constituencies, right? Like you need these U2F devices to exist and be readily available and hopefully cheap. You need clients, like web browsers, to support the protocol. And you need the relying parties, the websites, to add support for U2F as an option for authentication. So the cool thing is that today, U2F devices are cheap. They're usually about $20 or less. And they're available from a growing variety of manufacturers. Brad Hill, that same guy we mentioned earlier, has a really, really great GitHub repository where he's collecting reviews of these devices. So if you're interested in purchasing one, I would go there first, because a lot of smart security folks are really tearing these things apart and like trying to find which are the best. The main problems that remain in this regard are iOS support. For Android, there are, for example, like you can buy a YubiKey that has near-field communication support. And so you can just tap that on your phone if you have Android, and that totally works to fulfill the U2F protocol. But Apple doesn't make NFC available to third-party applications, so that's not an option on iOS right now. There are some people working on some different ideas, but that's still a work in progress. In addition, there are some kind of experimental new ideas. Like GitHub has this recent thing called soft U2F. It's a software token. So when U2F was designed initially, a lot of people were really into this idea of like hardware, hardware, hardware. Like keep the key in the hardware. It'll be totally safe from every possible attacker and from malware. But for a lot of people, like that isn't really their concern. That isn't the kind of adversary they're worried about. They can still realize a lot of the benefits of U2F by running it in software. And so soft U2F stores the keys in your like Mac OS keychain, but is really, really usable and easy to set up. So that's kind of a cool thing to take a look at. It's a new project. It's a work in progress. As for the clients, Chrome has had support for a long time because it was developed in-house at Google. But awesome news, just last week, Firefox Nightly landed native support for U2F, finally, which is great. And so that'll hopefully make it to the stable release in about 6 weeks. And when it does, I think about 80% of web browsers worldwide will have support for U2F, which is pretty great. Finally, websites. There's been kind of a parade of like big websites rolling out U2F as the good word spreads. And you can see a full list at this dongleoff.info, very humorously named website. But a great website, awesome, awesome work. It's supported by a lot of big sites like Google, Facebook, GitHub, et cetera. I would just say that if you are working on your own authentication and you're protecting sensitive user data, maybe consider adding it as an option to your own site.
So finally, I wanted to talk about some passwordless login systems, because while these things Garrett talked about are really nice, they're kind of all addressing very fundamental weaknesses in password systems. It's no surprise that passwords are kind of unusable for the average people. There's all these problems, like people forget them or lose them. They pick weak passwords. And then they reuse them on 20 different accounts. And password databases are easy to, well, they get hacked a lot, let's just say that. And only about 5%, well, unlike this room, which is not a representative sample, only about 5% of Americans use a password manager as their primary way to save passwords. Most people in this survey said they just memorized them or wrote them down or something, or just use the same one on all sites. So we can make some observations, which is that Garrett talked about all these ways you could do two-factor, such as SMS. And a related method is the verify login push notification that you may have seen on Google or Facebook, where Google says, oh, you're trying to log in on your computer. We're going to send you a verify notification to your Gmail app on your phone, and you tap that to log in. So that's another form of 2FA. And both of these are much more convenient for most people than remembering and typing in passwords. And also, given multiple ways of authenticating, users don't usually pick two factors, right? They only set up one of them. So some people have been thinking, like, why don't we just use what we've traditionally used as the second factor as the primary way for people to log in? And what would that look like? So actually, in 2015, Yahoo Mail tried this. They had a system called account key, where each time you sign in, you receive a push notification on your mobile phone in the Yahoo app for you to approve. And then once you do that, you'll be signed in immediately. So in the user flow, like the password input box was just gone completely. This kind of makes sense for Yahoo because they've had a number of password breaches in the past. And this, and their users don't always pick the best passwords, et cetera. So, and they all don't usually set up two-factor. So in their case, like you could strongly argue that the second factor, push verification, is stronger than the primary factor, which is passwords. So if people are only going to pick one factor, pick the stronger one and just offer that to them as their way to sign in. So look like this. You put in your username on Yahoo Mail. It sends you an account key, and it just says, are you trying to sign in? Tap yes, and you're done. So it's just proof of authentication by possession instead of passwords. So there's a service called Auth0 that does this, but for mobile, they only offer, they offer SMS and email, but they don't offer push notifications. So if you're using something like this, just keep in mind SMS is easy to hack, like Garrett said earlier. I wouldn't recommend using SMS as the only authentication factor. There's another thing that's kind of weird about password login systems that you may have noticed, which is that they're about only as secure as your email account. Because if someone doesn't have your password, but they do have access to your email, they can go to slack.com and say, I forgot my password, send me a reset link. And they get the reset link, change your password, and then they can log in forever and see all your strange loop messages. And so Slack actually kind of took this idea and turned it into a first-class login option, which you've probably seen. It's called Magic Links. So if you go to the Slack, this is from the Slack web app, desktop app, and it says it has the sign-in box, and it has two options: forgot password, or is your password too long to type? Email me a link. Amazingly, these are pretty much the same thing. If you click either of these links, it sends you an email. The email contains a link with a long one-time use token. You click that, the token gets used, and you log in by proving you control your email account. And that's a pretty nice user flow, especially if passwords are hard to type on your phone. But so a point here to make is email secure in transit? So for websites, most people are familiar with HTTPS, right? Like you see the lock icon, you see HTTPS://. That means you're safe to enter your password on your banking site or whatever. But email's a bit different. It uses a protocol called Start TLS, which under the hood is similar to TLS, except it's opportunistic. Well, what do I mean by that? So the way that mail servers usually negotiate encryption is like this. The first server is like, what's up? The second server says, I support encryption. The first server says, well, I also support encryption, so let's have an encrypted conversation. So then they start encrypting, and everything's great. The problem is, up until the encryption happens, like all of these messages are in plain text. So an attacker can do this. Server 1 says, what's up? Server 2 says, I support encryption. But then a man-in-the-middle attacker, pretending to be server 1, says, actually, I don't support encryption. And in a secure system, the conversation would just stop at this point. Like server 2 would say, I'm not willing to send my passwords unsecured. That's really bad. Let's just shut it down. But people really expect their email to be delivered, right? Like there's this expectation of reliability when you send your Gmail to your boss that it'll get there. So for this reason, most email providers have made the trade-off that they will send the email anyway, even if encryption is not negotiated. So in most cases, server 2 will just say, oh, OK, yeah, here's my password anyway, whatever. And that's not great. But the good news is, some Start TLS support has been going up. So, originally some servers didn't even support this opportunistic encryption. And around 2014, 2015, that started rising pretty dramatically. But it's not perfect yet. So for instance, yesterday I booked a flight and got this little red icon in Gmail, which means the message was not securely encrypted. So NSA can now have my booking code and do whatever they want, et cetera.
Nothing important in the email
yeah, nothing
whatsoever.
important.
Nothing
Enjoy my
sensitive.
vacation.
Yeah.
So that's it, yeah. So I hope we've given you some interesting things to think about when you're looking at password systems and authentication.
And we'll take questions, I think, after.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks.